Cool.
Cool.
How you been?
I am busy. Busy. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I've been quite busy since I got back. I had one of my homeless guys scared the wits out of a church plant.
Wait. You said, you wrote about that, and I really appreciated that thread. It was one of the best stories I've read recently. But what's a church plant? Is that like some sort of frond that you guys have?
So when I got here in 97, myself and another pastor worked hard on planting a whole bunch of new Christian Reformed churches in the area. And we brought in a lot of seminarians and students and basically threw them out into the world and gave them some coaching and found some money for them. And so then we planted a bunch of churches. And this is a daughter church of ours that has been, before COVID, living a couple miles away, but they lost one of their facilities and they were all shut down for COVID. You know, it's so funny because my church is just a bunch of grizzled old people. When COVID comes, they're like, we're all going to die anyway. Oh, come on, people, get a vaccine. Oh, I don't care. You can stick it in my arm if they want to. And so, but the young families, they're, especially this particular church plant is from an area of town that has a lot of, young people who are, they're sort of wokish in some of their own ways. And so, of course, they're all masked up and staying home. And many of them, they're all over the spectrum, actually. So we said, well, why don't you just start meeting back again on our church property here? You can meet outside. I didn't want my people meeting outside because they'd be falling and breaking hips, and that would be a disaster. So we stayed inside. And so the young people are outside, and then this homeless guy comes up, and he's got a beer in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, and he starts yelling at the band. Well, he's a musician, so they're doing it wrong. So and they're scared to death. So I get a text, you got to get down here. Okay. But he was, it usually doesn't last long. He found a place and passed out for a few hours. So, yeah. So today I've been kind of getting things settled again, and okay, now finding out what's going on with him and getting him settled, and then I gotta move him because there's a restraining order against him, and he's not supposed to be anywhere near the property. And then people are like, well, if there's a restraining order, why is he here? Well, go ahead and call the cops.
Huh.
They don't want to deal with him either. You got to talk them into dealing with him. And he's got to be here when they get here. And once he gets a sense that you've called the cops, he's out of here. So, I mean, it's all this stuff that you just, I'm just so used to dealing with it. I don't even think about it anymore. And then these poor people come in there and it's like, he could have attacked me. This isn't safe. So of course it's not safe. But life isn't safe. So, figure out how to deal with the world.
There was something you wrote in that thread, if I can recall it correctly, and if you can correct me if I recall it wrong. You said that the story of Lazarus and another one of Jesus's works haunts you.
Yeah.
And so what you see is a human there.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, so this guy, it's a weird thing. So the length of the church building here, there's a sidewalk along it. And it seems like the homeless people always want to physically lean against my office door, which means that for me to come in, I have to wake them up. I have to engage with them. And then usually I have to sort of move them out of the way, step over them, and get into the office. Now, of course, the story of Lazarus and the rich man, there's a poor man named Lazarus who is, probably the village put him outside the wealthiest man in the village's door so that he would do something for him. And of course, the rich man does nothing for Lazarus. And then the rich man dies, and Lazarus dies, and Lazarus is, there ensconced in the bosom of Abraham. And the rich man is in the hotter portions of Hades. And and that's, one of Jesus' parables. So I can't, so often, most of people in our society either treat these people as sort of an occasion for feeling good about themselves if they can give sort of $5 or $10, or they're a nuisance. And now, if they're living against your office door, and this guy did so for 7 years, well, and so I put pictures, because he'd garbage pick in the neighborhood, and he would fill this entire sidewalk with junk. Pastor, you might need this. No, I don't need that. And then for a while there was a toilet. There was actually a toilet that someone threw away that was just outside my office door. And, it's like, I don't want this toilet here. No, and he'd always, I'm an asset, not a liability. Well, because when he was in his manic phase, he'd be trimming the shrubs, and, then he'd clean up all the mess. But then when he'd get depressed, he would, it would all fill up with junk, and people would, come by to see me, and they'd look like, what kind of a church is this? And what kind of a pastor are you? Why don't you handle this? And it's like, I know what you think handling is. It's getting these people out of sight, out of mind, out of the way, so we can all go about our business.
Or reform them to disappear into the fold.
Right.
Yeah.
We used to hide them away in institutions, which had its upsides and downsides. And now in California, basically in the 70s and 80s, they changed a lot of the laws with respect to mental health, which meant that you're free to be crazy. That's relatively little that the law can do. So people are just living on the streets, panhandling. To me, it reminds me of my life in the third world. But
when was that?
But yet, in our society, we still throw a lot of money at these people, and with not a lot of effect.
Yeah. When was your third world life?
That was.
How old were you?
I was right out of seminary, so
25.
Let's see.
26.
I was 25, 26, yeah.
How long were you there?
I was there 6.5 years.
Oh, geez. That's dedication. And
yeah, we had our...
What were you doing?
I was a missionary, which meant that I was a church developer. So I worked with Haitian pastors who were in the Dominican Republic. And I was supposed to teach them things, but I think they taught me a lot more than I could have ever taught them. I had a seminary degree, but, most of their issues were not getting along with each other. They wanted me there because in a lot of places, missionaries are sort of spigots to affluence, and or at least spigots to help. And so no, I spent 6.5 years doing that. And I learned a ton.
What are some of the things that resonate from that experience to your virtual ministry?
It's remarkably difficult to help people. As right out of seminary, how old was I? Was I 25, something like that? Right out of seminary, yeah, I was 25. I'd been 25 or 26. I'd just been married a year. And you go down to this very poor place where most people are living on 50 cents or $1 a day. And I'm drawing a basic pastoral income, which makes me extraordinarily wealthy compared to them. Mm-hmm. And we've got at that point, a well-funded mission agency from my denomination. And we've got ideas about cottage industry and, all these fancy ideas to help poor people. And it's remarkable how little you can actually do with money. That was one of the big takeaways, that in this culture, you see this all the time. We really do believe we can fix the world with money, but I've known very rich people and I've known very poor people, and yeah, money's handy, but it doesn't do what you think it can. So I also learned I learned a lot there when it came to church planting here in the U.S. that churches can live without money, but churches can't live without leadership. And the real bottlenecks are the bottleneck. Your leaders both facilitate everything, but also constrain everything, which is why, for example, Bridges of Meaning Discord server, I don't run anything there, because if I ran that thing, it would have all of my limitations. So I try not to be in charge of a lot besides me. And then that means if someone wants to do something, I have a little aphorism, which is he who does decides. So if you have an idea, go do it. Because most times people have brilliant ideas for everyone else. Mm-hmm. And but the personal is the powerful. And so that's part of why I think my channel looks like it does, and why a lot of people are like, oh, you should go talk to these high status people out there. But I don't find that to be, you can build a big YouTube channel that way.
Yeah.
But I find it more interesting to talk to people who have little or no status, because they actually have the best stories.
I've taken that turn recently. When I was trying to build the channel, I just shot out invitations to everybody high status, and every once in a while you get somebody on, but when I get them on, I'm like, there's all this status between us. Yep. Like I can't actually engage with them. I have to engage with their itness or their thingness.
Yep.
And I guess one of your perennial discussion topics is Jordan Peterson. I was thinking about, if you'll allow me to build an analogy, you sent me a video, or you referenced a video about, it's a Yale courses video.
Yeah.
About the Old and the New Testament and how it's built. And the second episode, or the second lecture, is about the one person's theory on the difference between biblical monotheism and polytheism. And with polytheism, you have this meta-divine realm that the gods kind of are extracted or built out of. They're born out of that. And with the monotheism, God is completely transcendent to this meta-divine realm. In polytheism, you have all these rites and these rituals because magic actually operates, because everything's connected, and you can supplicate or even master the gods if you can figure out the right ritual. And I was just thinking about this internet world, which is, it's this meta-divine realm in a way, where there's this kind of this substance, and all these personalities are kind of being born into it. And some of them, and there's a status hierarchy. And I was thinking about there's ways that we become gods in a way, or at least icons, which isn't, I'm no longer me, I'm this entity over there. And some people with a lot of status become this super normal entity, or some sort of supernatural entity. I don't know where I was going to head with that, but dealing with that is uninteresting, and dragging people and putting them into this world to show humanity through the world rather than to engage with the world on its own terms seems more fruitful for me.
I think that's true. The high status game, it does a lot. It works. People use it. It's just an element of the ecosystem. You're exactly right. But it also, and I think actually a lot of what Jesus taught and modeled was about this, because, they had status hierarchies in his environment as well.
You think?
And yeah. And if you always, that's one of Jordan Peterson's points. There are always status hierarchies, and one of Peugeot's points. And Jesus, if you're often the evangelical frame through which people read the New Testament is this question about how can I save myself in the afterlife. That's a relevant frame, but it's not the only frame or necessarily the best frame. And I don't think that's the frame that the authors of the New Testament were trying to prioritize necessarily. And I don't say that to diminish the importance of thinking about the next lives. But if you read the New Testament, and it was a number of years ago, I read a commentary from Joel Green, I think it was. It was a good commentary on the Gospel of Luke. And for the first time, I began to notice status in the New Testament. And once I began to pay attention to that, I would see again and again in Jesus, and then it's also quite clear in the book of 1 Peter. And once you begin to see it, you begin to see it everywhere, which is common to attention. But Jesus keeps talking about status and he doesn't act as if status is irrelevant, but he exhorts his followers to approach status in a different way.
Okay.
Because the entire world is approaching status in this very natural way. And Jesus says, recognize that game, use that game when you need to, but don't give yourself to that game. And I think that's one of the takeaways from Jesus, that if you can learn it, a lot will be different. And, I've always thought about the fact that after his resurrection, if you believe he rose from the dead physically, he could have showed up to Pontius Pilate or to Herod. He could have played that game. I mean, if someone arose from the dead in our culture, we would, parade them before television cameras and all of this stuff. And we think that would somehow prove something. But the entire UFO thing, I think, is a wonderful experiment in epistemology right now, because it's like, well, I won't believe it until what exactly? I mean, it is not immediately obvious what we're talking about with any of these things. Mm-hmm. And so people are like, well, if ever a law of nature was broken, I would believe in miracles. No, it's not true at all. And C.S. Lewis, in his book Miracles, begins with a ghost story and says, the only person I know that has ever told me they've seen a ghost doesn't believe in ghosts. And that is to be human.
Was Jesus proposing a contravening game? Was he simply inverting a hierarchy? Or
well,
what?
That's the funny thing about Jesus. He does invert it. And you see him do that all the time. And that's part of what we see in the whole woke thing, which is they get that part right. But what Jesus does is manage both hierarchy and equality in a radically disruptive way. Mm-hmm. But because hierarchy and equality are opposites, they're tremendously difficult for us to know how to navigate. And so what Jesus does is basically say, watch me. And we get that through the narratives about him. Watch what I'm pointing out. Watch what I'm doing. Watch how I'm living. And that's how you need to navigate the realities of hierarchy and the heavenly assertions of equality. Because the equality is much more of a fiction than the hierarchy. The hierarchy, the Romans, the Greeks, they all believed in the hierarchy. It's just obvious. There are beautiful people, there are ugly people. There are strong people, there are weak people. There are wealthy people, there are poor people. We all know that. Mm-hmm. And this whole idea of an equality, well, that's sort of a augmented reality that we are seeing upon the world. And, Jesus has, been very successful in that, in some ways, all of the promoters out there of equality, or even a more tyrannical form of equality, which is equity. That's a really, every time someone promotes that, you should basically, give Jesus a footnote because that's what Jesus did. But Jesus also says, it's sort of like, here's electricity. If you're going to play with it, you should know what you're doing. Because if you don't know what you're doing, things are going to get funny. And that's sort of what we're seeing.
Okay. Do you have a history of equality where that idea came from? What you're talking about? Did Jesus invent it, I guess, if we can think of him as an inventor?
Well, almost everything Jesus used came out of the Old Testament. And you can find equality in the Imago Dei, in the image of God, that the man and the woman, God's image is the man and the woman are made in his image, both of them. There's an equality right there, which is radical. If you read Gilgamesh, you've got, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and then you've got like shrine prostitutes that, help bring Enkidu into manhood. But it's a story about two men. The Bible starts with this radical equality, sort of man and woman. And it's right there in the first chapter. He made them in his image, man and woman. And we're still trying to figure out what that means because men and women are not equal. Men have strength, women have productivity or reproductive power, but they have to be together. And so, all these issues are built into that text. And so Jesus comes along and, every civilization in the world started with the idea that there's us and them. And you find this in anthropology, like, for example, the Navajo. If you look at the Navajo language, who are the Navajo? The name for themselves is the people. We are the people. Everyone else is out there. You have Jews and Gentiles, Romans and barbarians. I mean, everyone plays that game. And Jesus begins to radically undermine that game. And what happens then in the church is a very radical undermining of it when suddenly you can have brothers and sisters who are created by the blood of Jesus instead of the blood of their parents. That is a radical view of equality, that people all now stand before God, to a certain degree, with the same standing. And that's very different from visions of life from the ancient world. So it was a Jewish idea. Jesus really mobilizes it, and the church really works it out and practices it on the stage of the Roman Empire. And that leads to our ideas of citizenship. There are lots of, these stories, these developments are tremendously complex, but it's quite clear that Christianity catalyzes that and expands it and popularizes it like really nothing else quite has.
Well, in the case of the homeless man who's appropriated your property, the church, I guess the church property, that is a reminder that the ideas of Christianity, though they are in the cultural soup, are constantly being overlooked, or constantly, like you were saying about, we give money, we try to disappear the problem, we try to overlook the problem, but the problem is always there. And what is it in that parable about Lazarus and the rich man where one ends up, where the hierarchy is somehow inverted in this imaginary world? And by imaginary world, I shouldn't use that word, but in this afterlife, in this post-game,
Right.
How does that actually play out in getting people to be responsible for their own stuff, or recognizing that some people can't do that, but most of us should, or most of us should recognize that that person is to be looked at in a certain way?
Well, in the ancient world, it was thought, and especially in the Jewish world, you see this at the time of Christ, it was thought that the poor have a vital service to perform, and that is to give those who have property and money an opportunity to give. Because everyone, there's always giving and receiving, and that's always happening. And if you have a lot of this, you should be giving. And so Jesus keeps talking about Actually, in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, "Don't store up treasures on earth," that's how it's usually translated in English. Language translation is always difficult. If you want it, one way of saying it is, "Don't heap heaps on earth." What are heaps? Heaps are anything. Can be gold, can be grain, can be clothing, can be all. Don't heap up things and imagine your life is made up of heaping up things. If you have heaps of things, you should distribute them. And so the poor are opportunities to distribute them. And so even in the Old Testament, if you look at Abraham or Jacob or Job or David, these are very wealthy people, and wealth was in some ways a sign of God's favor, as it were, because the reading God was always sort of done through sort of this karmic lens. If you're flourishing, you must be, in God's favor. If you're suffering, you must be, must have crossed God. This gets played out in the book of Job. Yeah. So then what the righteous do is that the righteous share. That's what it means to be righteous. And the idea is, in a very karmic way, if you share on earth, God will share with you in heaven. Yeah. And these ideas are not unique necessarily to Christianity or to Judaism, but they're fairly common in some ways. But really what the difference is between a lot of these religions are exactly how do the hierarchies and the equalities really play out in terms of the moral norms. Yeah. And that's what Christianity plays with. So, obviously with Lazarus and the rich man, the idea is, well, the rich man should have been, and the story, it's a parable, and it's full of hyperbole. Lazarus is as poor as he could be, and the rich man is as wealthy as he could be, and the rich man was not generous to Lazarus, and so therefore God will not be generous to the rich man.
Okay.
In God's kingdom. So
there's so much there. One thing I want to just make mention of is that you said the righteous are those who give. We have a version of righteousness in our culture that tells other people to give, or goes around and says, you have too much, you should give.
Right.
I guess they're distributing their own moral authority in that sense.
But that's an old game. I mean, everybody, that's the game we play. And the difficult thing is that if you, again, I mean, part of my issue with, I'm sort of like Brett Weinstein in that I've always been politically on the left. And that's by virtue of where I was raised and when I was raised. But then I began to see this stuff.
I'm sorry to do this, but could you define that for the sake of this conversation? Just roughly, I guess, more into government being able to have programs and...
Yeah. I grew up with black folks, and so I voted like them. I'll say it that way.
Okay.
And I voted with the majority of my votes were almost always reliably African American.
Okay.
And my father, planted a church. I know that's weird. My father started a church in a black area of New Jersey, just outside of New York City. And I grew up during the civil rights movement. So the civil rights leaders were our heroes. And so that was the political first draft that I began with.
Okay.
But the civil rights movement was a deeply Christian movement that had built into the movement a lot of this Christianity that was integral to it. And what I've seen happen lately is not, in my opinion, terribly Christian because, and I think Jordan Peterson is right, ideologies are crippled religions. Religions are sort of these full panoply of opponent dynamics, where you've got, on one hand, you have these inversions. On the other hand, you have these equalities, and they're always working. And so over thousands of years, all of this is built into the religion. And what happens with an ideology is they just take a little piece of it and they run it up to the top of the hierarchy and say, this is all there is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then nothing is going to work because you don't have all of this balancing that the system has had.
DEI.
Right. The image of God.
No, I'm talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as their God.
Oh. Yeah. And so and I first started to notice this about 2013 with in my denomination, because the same-sex marriage thing, of course, is rumbling through denominations. And, I'm very high in openness. I tend to be politically, that gets manifest in my, my political history over on the left. And so, I wasn't a homophobe. I didn't have that reputation in my denomination or anything like that. But when I began to listen to the rationalizations and the reasons given for changing the system, one very Christian reason is these people have been marginalized and brutalized for something that they didn't ask for, that they necessarily didn't even, you should have compassion on these people. Absolutely. But I began to hear different narratives, and I was saying, well, that isn't what we've always said the gospel is and how the world is. I can see this coming out of that, but you've actually started working on a different kind of religion. And, I didn't have any of that language from Peterson yet because I didn't discover him until 2017 about, crippled religions and ideologies and some of those things. And so then, when Peterson came about, he gave me a language where I could say, oh, okay, well, now I can, at least pieces of a language where I can say, okay, some of these things are going on. And I didn't know necessarily a lot about psychology or any of that. So, I got lessons in some of those things. But
is there I wonder if we can try to map a little bit of this out, watching your dual cultural shifts that you've seen, growing up embedded in the civil rights culture.
Yeah.
I don't know to what degree you participated in the actual movement, but that was a part of your culture, and then in the church culture. Both of those things change at the same time, in my estimation, what we've seen since probably 2008, 2013, it just started building up from 2000 something. It started building up. It was a rebirth or a reanimation of the civil rights themes, and we're watching it crash through our entire society and reorganize every single culture, from knitting circles to major denominations to the federal government to the military. It's taking over everything.
Right.
In your estimation, what are some of the functioning differences between what we're witnessing now and what came before? Just in the church, you were saying that there's something different. Like, what are the pieces? What are they rearranging? Are they rearranging hierarchies? Are they rearranging modes of engaging with hierarchies? Or what?
Well, Dr. King says in his speech in Washington that we'll be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. That idea about colorblindness.
Yeah. His daughter's not wanting any white people to take that out of context now, just to give her due.
I'd love to know what context she's talking about. I've read a ton of this man. And that is complicated because he, if you understand the seminaries he went to, the ideas he was working, he takes his father was a fairly highly privileged black pastor in Atlanta. He did not grow up down below. Malcolm X did more, but I think it's really helpful to look at Dr. King and Malcolm X and look at their two strains of ideas. And what we really see a lot more of right now is sort of the Islamic makeover Malcolm X that was killed by his previous tribe. And we see much more of ideas that were promoted by the Nation of Islam.
Okay.
And today continue to be maintained by, let's say, Louis Farrakhan. And if you look at the idea, so the Nation of Islam, not really Islamic.
Yeah, no.
If you look at the Nation of Islam, they tend to have a rather Manichaean mythology about the evil of whiteness. And basically, white people are devils. That's how they work in that worldview.
Yeah.
I mean, I would encourage someone to there's some really excellent biographies. The autobiography of Malcolm X was as many biographies written. I mean, Alex Haley really wrote that. They tend to be much more propaganda platforms. But there are some really excellent biographies of Malcolm X out there. People should read them now. And what you will see is that in some ways, the options between Dr. King and Malcolm X continue to work through the system. And right now, if you look at a lot of the more, let's call them, as John McWhorter does, the third wave anti-racists, in many ways, they're more similar to pre-Islamic conversion Malcolm X when he was deep within the Nation of Islam. And if you read the story of Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam, you begin to see some of the same things that we see working out now, that hierarchies will develop and tyrannies will happen. I mean, Malcolm X was killed by his own people, by his former people, because he was basically leaving the movement. And that's the sort of tyrannies we're seeing, I think, in infancy. I know I'm really careful about how much anti-woke talking I do, because I think we give it power when we pay too much attention to it. And my hope is that a lot of this stuff is going to sort of be put away, sort of like my striped brown bell bottoms from the 1970s.
Well, if you look at the latest iteration of the pride flag, it's not going to have long of a shelf life.
And I'm old enough to remember a lot of the 70s. And some of what we're seeing today is sort of a rehashing of the 70s. But because these things, a lot of these ideas are inherently unstable, which, hang on a second. I got to deal with someone who, just pause. Bill Clinton had bimbo eruptions. I have eruptions of a wholly different aesthetic.
I love the intrusion of the real world into the virtual, though. I have a lawnmower outside, which is kind of a different level of nuisance to nuance.
Yeah. What were we? I think when you look at what James Lindsay is pointing out, many people right now are pointing this out. There's so much of this stuff, it just can't be sustained. You can game it so easily, just verbally, and once it's easily gamified, people will just use it to get money and attention and status. That's exactly what happens. And once you start doing that, lots of other people then will resent you for it. And so a lot of this stuff is, Orwell, I thought had a lot of good insight into these dynamics too, because he saw it in other iterations. And once the rent seeking starts, the resentments start, and then people start tearing other people down, and we'll probably go back to a game that is at least at a level that looks a bit more fair. And most of our meritocratic games, the reason why we sort of settle on those and they can be more stable is at least there's a level of fairness. that we all see. So I see, I lament the ways in which some of these ideas have destroyed institutions like your alma mater and, really intruded in your life and the life of, Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying and Jordan Peterson and others. And I see that happening in churches, but it will only get so far, and the deeper patterns of resentment and merit and fairness will continue to undo these things. Mm-hmm. That's my take anyway. It's my hope.
I'm reaching for some sort of formulation about resentment and fairness and how Peterson warns against resentment, but I think it's a natural reaction to unfairness.
Yeah.
And people are using unfairness and resentment to do unfair things. And they're going to end up being the brunt of the resentment that they garner.
My real fear about this movement is that in the long run, the people that it purports to help will really be the ones who are hurt. Because Chris Arnott, in an interview, he wrote that book Dignity. I've got it around here somewhere. I did an interview with him. He was one of the guys that I actually reached out to because I wanted to talk to him, because he was this Wall Street broker or Wall Street banker or something, and so he's making all sorts of money, but he had this habit of walking. So he liked to walk, and he'd often walk with a camera, and he loved to walk in the poorer areas of town, and so he just began to do that, and began, of course, to meet people, homeless people, prostitutes, junkies, drug dealers, and began to build relationships with these people. And that's what his book Dignity is about. And so he talks about front row and back row America. He tells a story of, I think could have been a sociologist, who basically said, you want to know how to make a racist? Just let's say, have a whole line of people and then let someone of another race cut in front of them. Just play that out societally. That whole line of people is going to resent the one who cut the line. And that's what we're going to see. And I also think there's another theme that I haven't heard anybody talk about, which is, I've been thinking about why the change, because again, my life was I grew up in this context of white and black America, but African Americans for a long time in this country have sort of had a special status by virtue of, not a happy status, but a special status by virtue of the history of slavery. But they continue to be about 12% of the American population. Hispanics have long since passed them numerically. Immigrants from Africa continue to come. Immigrants from Black Latin America, the Caribbean, continue to come. Asians continue to come. America tends to see race issues in black and white. And of course, George Floyd and a number of these other incidences have those grab our salience hierarchies.
Yeah.
But I grew up in Patterson where it was black and white, but around us, the Puerto Ricans were coming up. After I left Patterson, people from the Middle East started coming in. Here in California, it's always been multidimensional. And so I think part of what we see happening too is African Americans have sort of had a sort of...
They're on the top of the bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah. In terms of our salience hierarchies.
Yeah.
And so they've been sort of most favored, and I'm really most favored community in need of help. And so that has framed the conversation. And I've always just found it tremendously ironic that with this new wave of anti-racism, on one hand they say, sort of like pre-Islam Malcolm X, white people are devils. On the other hand, they say, you must wait until white people help you. And it's like, wait a minute.
You must wait.
And
Could you reframe that? What do you mean? You must wait until white people help you?
well, you can't help yourself. We need all of this machinery to rescue you. As John McWhorter says, this is the only people in the history of the world that can't overcome their adversity. So, and the whereas in my upbringing in second wave anti-racism, I am in no way blind to the fact that the legacy and history of slavery, Jim Crow, a whole bunch of the history of the African American community have obviously contributed to many of the challenges that many in that community, not all, and that's another problem with how it's framed today, many in that community continue to struggle. This idea that the nation will continue to pay attention to them to the degree that it has in the last 150 years, I suspect will go away. Because you're going to find, so in my church, pre-COVID, we had a Nigerian Anglican church that was renting from us. They come to America like the land of opportunity from Nigeria. You have people coming from Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the African American dynamics are not the same with these communities. And the wealthiest segment demographic of the American population are certain groups of Asians, and they're more affluent than white folk. So, and white has always been an obnoxious category to me because,
well, the Dutch were put down pretty low on the white European hierarchy.
Yeah. And the other side, so I've basically got Frisian, who are the Dutch underclass, and I've got Jewish. That's my biological ancestry. So it's like, so it's tremendously, you can't just simplify it and sort of resolve things. And I've known that, again, back to my work in the Dominican Republic, watching my father poured 36 years into a very poor community in Paterson, New Jersey. And it was interesting when I went back in 2013 for his memorial service after he died. When I went to New York City in 2006, I hadn't been to New York City really since the 80s and early 90s, since the 80s really. When I went back to New York City in 2006, it's like, what happened to this place? I mean, in the 1980s and 70s, New York was going bankrupt, and it was a mess. New York now, it's kind of like this yuppie playground. And where'd all these beautiful white people come from in New York City? Then I went to Paterson, which is just 15 miles away, and it's like, nothing happened here. In fact, if anything, it got worse. And so, once you have a high resolution picture on a lot of these things, I look at a lot of the propaganda that's put out, and I just don't believe any of it.
So you said earlier in today's conversation, you said that it's impossible to help people. Maybe you didn't say that. Maybe you didn't say impossible.
It's really hard.
Yeah, it's really, really hard. Why continue to strive to help people? Or what is the proper way to go about engaging in the project of helping people?
Well, for one thing, and this is also complex too, because for one thing, it's really good for your soul to pour out your life helping people. That doesn't mean it's pleasant. It doesn't mean you'll necessarily be effective. But what it does mean is that you will, so at the top of the Christian hierarchy is love. Everyone in the world wants to be loved. But to love is a costly, sacrificial thing. If you live your life learning how to love, you will become an amazing person. And that is essentially, that is the promise of the gospel. And so live your life learning to love.
Becoming an amazing person. So that maybe that's the clue on the other game that Jesus was proposing. Like heap. I get it's still a heaping of treasure, but it's the outer limit. You're becoming a person rather than a wealthy person.
Right.
Right?
Right. Right. You're becoming an adult. You're becoming like God. So in the Sermon on the Mount, there's all this stuff, and then there's this one verse says in the King James says, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." And that verse was often sort of taken out and saying you should be perfect like God is perfect. Oh, great, what a standard!
Yeah.
But the verses before it are all God causes it to rain on the just and the unjust. God causes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. Therefore, be perfect like God is. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It means that...
So those first two lines that you quoted were breaking karma. They're breaking the idea of karma.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So without
exactly
karma, right. with that broken, what's this perfectness mean?
It means, so when Jonathan Peugeot talked to Jordan Peterson, they talked about theosis, which is the word that the Orthodox like to use. And then the Roman Catholics said, hey, wait a minute, we teach that too. And the Protestants said, well, that's basic Christianity, that if God is defined for you by the revelation of Jesus Christ, then you can become like God if you become like Jesus. What do you mean by that? Being able to walk on water and raise the dead and heal the sick? No. Well, that might happen too. But the center of it is love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemy. Figure out how to do that. Now, that's a really difficult thing because our low resolution take is, the guy outside my door, he, needed to talk to me right then. Call 911 on me. Okay. Well, I've done this countless times before.
Wait, he's asking you, it's like some sort of weird Harry Carey?
Yeah, call 911 because he wants to get to the hospital because he's not feeling good.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is that if I would call 911 right now, 10 minutes from now, he might not be here. And then I've got to deal with the cops and the firemen and explain that I called 911 for a guy who's no longer here. And then everybody rolls their eyes and the response time to this stuff continues to go down. Okay, so there's a whole game. And that's what I say by loving someone does not mean just relinquishing your will to them.
Mm-hmm.
Loving someone means, as every parent knows, as every spouse knows, as every lover knows, as every good neighbor knows, trying to, as best you can, in community with your neighbor, do for them as a loving God would do for them. In other words, give them what they really need and want, and that might differ a little bit from what they say they need and want. And that's it. But that itself is a tricky thing because in a sense, you're sort of taking a status upgrade and saying, you say you want and need this, but I know you need that. We experience this as children.
Yes.
But with each other, it's a much more complex game because I am not this man's master. I am trying to be his friend.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking
figuring out how to love him is hard.
Yeah. To make it really selfish and probably cut a lot of people out of the conversation, but I think that you can transpose this on to anybody listening to this is in a status hierarchy and are achieving status or watching it devolve in front of them or, slip away through their fingers. So with regards to this really lame game that I play on the internet with this weird meta-divine realm, there's a difference between theosis and apotheosis. Apotheosis would be human beings becoming gods, which I think is a magnification or amplification of their own will. Whereas theosis is a rendering of your will to God or a modeling of your will onto what you perceive of as the holy order, which is a paternal or a parental, let's say, order of over-contextualizing or super-contextualizing the person in a greater hierarchy of needs and seeing how if you can play them right, they actually grow in their own agency rather than just relying on something else to give them what they want right now, right? Teach a man to fish
Exactly.
kind of thing, right?
Yep.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And I love Vervaeke's language of agency here.
Yeah.
And, in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, he referenced another author who talked about addiction as reciprocal narrowing. And that's what you see in an addict's life. So here's this 61-year-old man, outside my door right now, laying in clothing he's found in the garbage, begging me to do the simplest task that almost any third grader can do, which is put 3 numbers into a telephone. Why can't he manage it? Why doesn't he have a phone? What's going on there? I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of reciprocal narrowing in his life. And you're exactly right in that my interaction with him, if I do it well, if I do it with agape, if I do it with love, it will bring reciprocal broadening into his life. And that he, after his interaction with me, will be more capable, he will be more himself, and he also will be able to do this for others.
Yeah. I've heard that language applied to my conversation with Lisa Marciano a couple years ago about gender ideology and especially young people getting on Twitter or SJW-ifying themselves. And I'm like, well, how do you know if the narrative's good or bad? How do you know if it's right or wrong? Because they're dressed up the same. It's dressed up in righteousness. How do you know if this is good or bad? And she said, does it make you narrow? Does it narrow yourself and your experience in your life, or does it broaden your experience in your life? And I've seen a lot of this pattern of people growing out of social justice or critical social justice. They let go of their anxiety, and then that whole narrative loses a lot of its luster because they're no longer being able to work out their anxiety on a global scale anymore. Because they've let go of that which has tied them to that narrative, and then they start to say, "Oh, there's other things that I can do, and invest myself in." And then you watch them be able to have a stronger and stronger effect on more and more people, with less and less anxiety, and actually decrease the anxiety around them rather than increase it. And that's a more stable, scalable narrative. Even though we are kind of clutched in the thrall of anxiety for whatever reason on all these different systemic levels and interpersonal levels.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that's a good... So if you think about a child and you're raising a child, what do you want for that child? You don't want that child to continue to be dependent upon you financially, emotionally. You want some interdependence. In fact, what you want is that someday... Now that child may depend on you, but someday you're going to want to be able to depend on that child when you are needy. Maybe in old, as an elderly person, maybe, increasingly in the throes of dementia. And so if, in fact, this is the posture of all of our relationships, what we build around us then is, in fact, what we long for, which is a community where we will be welcomed, we will be trusted, we will be cared for, one that you can trust. And that's what people long for. That's what they want. That's what they need.
I think that there's a way to, not necessarily empathy or sympathy, but a way to engage with hope in the project of helping others by always seeing that somebody has a room to get a little bit broader. Everybody has a room, even on their dying breath, they have a room to do something unexpected, to do something beautiful, to do something for others. And I guess to constantly return to that. When you said in your thread about being haunted by the Lazarus at the doorsteps of the rich man, and you're watching this man, now I understand why there's this poor man in front of your rich door.
He's literally at my door.
So you saw a human being there. You saw somebody with the capacity to still have agency, the capacity to not be completely a ward of the state or give up.
Hang on a second. I think he just went in the sanctuary with my coffee break ladies. Now I have to be a shepherd.
Okay.
So
First, I want to take my stuff I put my storage across the street.
Okay, why don't you go take your stuff to the storage
And then
locker?
I'll come back and move you.
Okay, okay,
Is that better?
that's better.
Okay.
You can go right out this door.
I need help.
I know.
It's good that I get rid of it.
Okay, go bring it to your storage locker. See, and then people, and I laugh at situations like this, and people are like, it's so cruel to laugh. But
Yeah.
it's like, no, on one hand, I've done this so often that, the ladies in there were, reasonably scared, and they're trying to protect, don't go in his office. He's talking to someone. And they're looking out for me. And they've been through some things with him, but I've been through these things with him so often. So, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to call 911. I'm going to talk to them. And then they're going to ask questions like, well, does he have any weapons? Well, yeah. So they're going to say, well, then we have to send the police first. Okay. So then they send the cops, which is sometimes just this little woman. You got 4 big burly firefighters, all of whom could take them in a minute, but they can't touch them. So a little lady cop has to talk to them. And of course, if anything happened, the firefighters would have to rescue the cop. I live in this absurdity. So now, he's got a storage locker over at the place across the street. So he's going to take this stuff that he has taken out of other people's garbage cans and put them in the storage locker. And then I'll call 911, and then we'll wait, and then they'll come. And then he's going to have to talk his way into the psych facility because the beds are scarce. And so they prioritize. And so that's what I do not on camera. That's part of what I do not on camera. So
What happens when you get unbelievably sad?
me,
Yeah. Maybe you don't.
I don't much. I'm pretty fortunate in that I've got a pretty happy disposition. But just like loving, though, sadness in the right way can also be an opportunity for growth, because, there have been times in my life when, not because of this kind of thing right now, this is where I love and respect John Vervaeke and his religion that's not a religion. I just don't think he can really compete with the real thing. In that, part of why, if you've ever been broken and had almost everything stripped away to the point that Jesus is all you got, you learn something. And so when you're despondent, you actually have a name that you can call out to. And, this guy is Mormon, he's LDS, and we have very interesting theological conversations. But I had another friend whose mother was bipolar, and she sort of hated it because her mother would put on Mahalia Jackson records, and just when she was in her downswing, and but at least if you've got Jesus, you've got someone to cry out to. And I don't know how I would live if I didn't have that. This kind of stuff doesn't get me down. I'm just so used to it. But there have been other times in my life with other things far more personal and critical, and you learn to rely on God, and you just basically go to God and say, hey, look, I got nothing. Most of the time when I think I have something, I really don't, because it can all be taken away from me. But I am going to trust in you that whatever happens, it's sort of Jacob wrestling with God. Jacob wrestles with this angel, which is the angel of the Lord. It's a very mysterious scene, and wrestles with him, and seems to be winning, but it's getting light, and demands that the angel bless him, and the angel touches his hip, and suddenly he's crippled, and well, is that crippling a blessing? Well, actually, it sort of was, because Jacob, of course, knew that Esau was coming with 400 men, and the one last resort Jacob would have would be to run, and the angel has just taken that away from him. And the whole point about the Jacob story is Jacob never understood how to trust, and so God basically says to him, "I'm going to take away all of your resources, and you will trust in me. And when you start trusting in me, then I can really bless you." And so when in very dark times of my life, that's where I went. And I knew I could go there because of who brought me up and the people around me that I had been brought up with. And many of those folks were exactly the kind of people that third wave anti-racism purports to want to help. And I saw them turn to Jesus. They didn't trust in the government. They had a very clear idea of what the government
for that matter
wasn't going to do for them.
Yeah.
They trusted in Jesus.
Yeah.
And did that mean that they received money? Not necessarily. But again, money is not really what this world is about.
There's another way of looking at everything. I think, and I have these conversations, I guess, for instance, last week I had a conversation with a very talented, very articulate, very powerful woman. And we ran into each other pretty hard about her idea of a world that she wants and my questions about how to get there. And, and then her experiences of being misabused or abused by men, and my questions about to what degree do women have agency when they are at the receiving end of negative male attention or sexual attention. To what degree can they choose? Am I traumatized by this, or am I something else by this? And just asking those questions, just to ask the questions. I didn't propose anything, but just asking the questions has now awarded me a pretty vehement cohort of women going around saying that I'm condoning rape now, because I'm just asking to what degree do people have agency in disparity or in adversity. And I know that just with the topic of women and sexual harassment, or women trying to be in the workplace, and historically the way that men have treated women in America up to very recently, and still it's going to continue. It's going to continue, is not a good thing. I don't want that to happen. I don't know how to stop it, but I don't want it to happen. But I keep on coming back to, well, is this all about societal change or personal development? And I don't even know if that's a false equivalency or if those two things are mutually exclusive. I don't know how to approach these big societal issues on the level of society. I can only approach them in my imagination, and to how does the individual deal with that? How do we deal with that? How does each individual deal with that? And if you want a world with zero rape, I don't know how you get there, but how does the individual work towards that? And so I'm trying to, I guess, square that circle by saying that my entire worldview is informed by the same thing that you're talking about, where this is the ultimate game is to be a good person, and not be a good person in the fact of doing good work, but being an amazing person, I guess you said, which transcends a moral evaluation. Yeah, of course you should be a good person, but you should be a really rich character, and whatever is enriching your character, that's the ultimate game for me. That's the ultimate thing that we're being handed in this world, is the ability to paint with the canvas of a personhood. that's made up of all these different other factors, including richness, including wit, including empathy and care and all these different faculties. But there's something, again, that transcends all the identities is that individual at the heart of that. And that's kind of my guiding star. So I still don't know how to be a social creature or a political activist or have any sense of understanding of what I should do politically at all. But I do understand that if I can listen to more and more people's stories and attend to them in the correct way, I can give insight into what we are doing here rather than what's going on in society. Yeah, what's going on, the social issues, what is wokeness or the gender ideology or all these different topics are just contexts for character.
Yeah. There's an agent-arena relationship. That's another Vervaeke thing.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And you are what you are always within an arena. This also gets sort of into the meta-divine realm.
Yeah.
And in a sense, what we want to do is be, well, in Christian terms, we want to be filled with the Spirit of God. What is the Spirit of God? The Spirit of God is the patterns of God. It's that which is God's, we
Love.
want God to indwell in us, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But there's a funny, we have to remember what kind of arena we're living in. And here's an irony. All of us would love to have magnificent physical physiques. In order to do that, you have to engage in the arena with adversity. And so when it comes to our desire, when it comes to our desires, to our desire to live in a safe space, let's use that word. Is this world itself a safe space? No. The natural order is not a safe space. Nature is red in tooth and claw. The book, The Life of Pi, begins with the observation that we go to the zoo and we look at a lion and we see a lion in the cage and we feel bad for the lion. And we say, oh, that lion should be out on the savannah, hunting gazelle. And if that lion were able to speak, we might say, would you rather be on the savannah hunting gazelle? Or would you like to be here in the Bronx where people bring you your food every day and provide you with health care? And we know that lions in the zoo outlive lions on the savannah. So what do we want? And in The Life of Pi, he makes the observation that if you were to say, oh, you're a Homo sapien, you belong on the savannah. If they were to drag us out of our lovely home on the west coast of North America and plop us naked on the savannah, we would cry abuse. But if we were to live naked on the savannah, I would probably have better cholesterol scores. I would lose my body fat. I might become physically stronger. My, eyesight and hearing could become sharper. That or I would die. And so
you might be able to hear God better too.
I probably would. And, to where our thread was going before, part of what happens in religious contexts is people, I think Peterson is right about this, people voluntarily pursue abstinence in order to grow. In other words, they voluntarily monkey with their arena in order to become the agent they want to be. That's what you do when you go to the gym. People throughout history would look at us and say, we're nuts. We run when there's nothing to run from, and we go and lift heavy weights, even though we're not doing any work with that. What are we doing? We're adjusting our arena in order to become the agent we want to be. And this is another problem with a lot of the present discourse in our society, in that we imagine that a comfortable living room with Netflix is going to create agency and, superior human beings. Well, why would we think that? The couch potato means what it means because we understand what a comfy couch eventually turns us into. So, and obviously, I, as a father, I have two daughters. I want them treated magnificently. And now after COVID, my daughters are starting to date again, and that sets up a whole thing. And, if I hear any young man not treating my daughter well, they're going to talk to me and my 3 sons. And, because we love, our daughter and sister, and we want the best for her. They should probably be more afraid of her mother, but that's another story.
Yeah.
So we have to, there is a reality that none of us doubt. We have to bring that element back into the conversation. And I think that's part of what made Jordan Peterson such an explosive individual 3 years ago was he brought that back into the conversation and said, hey, wait a minute. Do you want to become a person of power and strength and beauty with whom the world must contend? You're probably not going to do that in an environment free from adversity. Because if there's one thing we know about human beings, they may or may not, and this is the crazy thing about us, sometimes situations of adversity narrow us, but sometimes they grow us. And here's the even less convenient fact. Out of a general population, many will be narrowed, some will be broadened. But probably everyone will be broadened and narrowed in different ways because that's how complex the world is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's some aspect of the equity, diversity, and inclusion image of God that I fear is that it supposes to know what greatness is. It supposes to know what goodness is. And the way it achieves that is the most paltry, anti-aesthetic, moralizing, like the lowliest form of goodness ever. It's just so weird that the church lady is like now installed in every single academic institution, has her own office and $160,000 a year to go around telling everybody else what to do. And I understand that we do need moral exemplars. We do need people that are promulgating the good and saying this is what the good is, and let's try to work on the good, and that there are certain, maybe even organizational ways in which corporations can instigate virtue in the workforce. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe that could be a good thing. And I don't know if this is just because I'm rebellious at heart, and this is what makes me, I think, on the left, is that I want to tear down every order, even though I guess leftists is more about centralization of power. That's the thing about the left. I don't understand it, because the bottom part is destroying everything, and then the top part wants to be complete totalitarian. So I don't know what left means. But I have both of those tendencies, and I flee from order, but I'm constantly seeking the perfect order in a way.
Right. And those are some of the inconsistencies built into the left, and they're maddening. Yeah.
So what is the going forward in this season of summer coming up? Are you working thematically on your channel through certain content? Do you have a series that you are working on, some sort of centralized plan? It's all constantly emergent.
It's constantly emergent. I don't know. I have to sit down, and my wife and I have to plan our vacation schedule this summer. She's a school teacher, so summers are the times that we do this. But, I've got a whole bunch of extra vacation because I didn't take any last year in 2020. And so at some point I want to work on starting new meetups. I have to figure out the next stage for the Sacramento meetup. In terms of my channel, sermonically, I'm working on the Apostle Paul, but that's, I do that for church more than my channel. My channel is much more me wrestling with just sort of what I'm wrestling with. And if you look at the very long view, you can find certain consistencies that I'm working through. But episodically, a lot depends on what's happening now and what I'm thinking about, or maybe what's going on in my life off camera. Mm-hmm. And so I've sort of used YouTube as a canvas on which to paint out my own questions and what's amazing about this canvas is it talks back, and it, there are comments, there's a Discord server, there are emails that people send me, videos, conversations like this one. So YouTube for me has just been one giant learning gymnasium, and that's sort of how I've used it. I don't really think of myself as a content producer, because if I were producing content, I'd have to be a whole lot more organized, but I'm really not.
And you have to do much more post-production as well,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
How's the this Discord server, Bridges of Meaning? What is that about? Is there intention or?
Yeah, for me. So my channel evolved. I when people figured out what I was doing and they knew me, they said, "Oh, you're just doing what you always have done, but you're doing it on YouTube now." So, when Jordan Peterson, rode that status rocket in 2016, 2017, 2018, there are a lot of interesting questions that he prompted in my mind. And I noticed that I thought, YouTube is actually quite integral to what is happening around him. And so I started playing with YouTube, and I expected to have a couple dozen people watch my video, and I might, whereas with the Freddie and Paul show, we had 15 subscribers. I thought we might have maybe a couple hundred, and that would be good, because then I'd have some more conversation partners. But it went more than there, and then people wanted to talk to me, so I started recording those conversations, and we started a local meetup. And the people in the local meetup wanted to facilitate more conversations of this style, of this nature. And so members of the local meetup developed the Discord server. And then they did so in conjunction with a lot of the people who found me early on. And so communities started to develop. And then I had people from other cities asking me about what I was doing, and they wanted to have their own meetup group. So I would do a little bit of traveling and encourage them to
Oh, this is
meet.
just like your church planting days.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Okay.
So, and then actually, right when COVID was hitting, we were on a tour. So I was in Arizona and Southern California, starting ad hoc meetups of people who watch my channel and seeing if there was a leader present who might want to facilitate something of a more ongoing nature. And then COVID hit. Otherwise, we were going to go up, Pacific Northwest all the way into Vancouver, because I can sort of leverage my Christian Reformed network to do this. So I basically will call a pastor in a local church, say, "Hey, I've got some people in your town who need a room." And most churches have empty rooms during the week. And so they would say yes, and we'd get another meetup going. And so I've sort of started a network of people in conversation around these kinds of issues. And then, I started calling it Estuary, because there was obviously a significant Christian contingent involved, but not just Christian. And so for the Christians, this was an opportunity to have their ideas tested by skeptics and doubters. And I think that's really healthy for Christian, because, the agent arena relationship, Christians, when they're all sort of insulated and isolated in churches, become very weak Christians. And
Just like academics.
Just like academics, which is academia is the daughter of the church.
Yeah.
Suffer some of the same things. So in Estuary, I want Christians to get out there and have plenty of skeptics and other people tell them exactly what they think and that they're wrong, and have Christians figure out how to live with that and how to respond.
Okay, how do you set up a context in which that can be possibly fruitful or not devolve into chaos?
I think that is, what happened in the evolution of my channel is that I think some of my manner attracted people who like the way I talk and relate to people who are different than I am, and began to do similar things. And what that did was create a culture where we said, these are the ground rules. This is how you can talk together. Now, every now and then we'll have someone swim into the estuary and be a real jerk, and they're fairly resistant to that, but there are lines, and then someone will say, "All right, you're not really helping us. You're going to take a time out outside of this estuary for a little while."
And then they go and sit, park in the front door. for everybody to step
sometimes,
over.
or they come into my. I'm more lenient than a bunch of the Bridges of Meaning administrators. I have a very high tolerance for disorder, as you can tell. I can have people threaten my life, and I'll say, I don't think you're going to pull it off. So, okay. So I have a high tolerance for that. But some of me, and this was a sort of a surprise, some of me got into my community. And people began to act like me. And I don't think any of us quite knew what was going on. But that created a context in which, we can have some of these tougher conversations. We can disagree without getting disagreeable. And we can have productive relationships. I remember when I first started talking to John Vervaeke, I got a fair amount of heat from people. Oh, Buddhism. Oh, New Age. Oh, because he's not a Christian. I said, I don't care. Sam, who is a non-Trinitarian, he came in, and a bunch of the Trinitarians just kind of, they could deal with atheists, but non-Trinitarian claws out. It's like, no, just put those claws away, and then eventually relationships build, and that's part of what I wanted to see in a community where they could begin to handle the stuff, and part of that has to be me modeling it.
Yeah. Eventually relationships build. I guess that's the other thing. So for me, starting with personal development or development of character is the primary, I guess the riches in heaven. That's probably what it means. Which would be, I explained it on your channel when they had me on last Friday, where you're so close to being a receiver, or you're so receptive that if you're standing in front of a child who's throwing a tantrum, you know the right word and the right tone of voice to completely untie that knot. You can untie any knot. So that's for the individual to attain, but it's those ongoing relationships which would be the arena where character is ultimately proved, and not proved just negatively by surviving something, but actually shown in all of its complexity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you worked with children, and children are a wonderful group of people to work with, because a lot of this stuff that we sort of rely on in a very rational society, all of these words, they don't work so well with children. But children see and know. And once they learn they can trust you, now suddenly you have a space in which you can afford them some agapic reciprocal broadening. And that's part of the disaster that we have, that people are not having children and they're not having enough children, because children will teach you this fast.
Yeah. There was this one girl, I was working in the toddler room, so I guess 1 to 2 years old, or whenever they were breached and could speak a certain level, then they'd move up to the preschool. But there's this one girl, whenever a new kid gets in, they are really upset. For at least a week, you're going to have a lot of crying going on.
Oh,
and this one girl was really willful, so she stretched out to about 3 weeks of bloody murder screaming during nap time for the full hour and a half, just bloody murder screaming. And somehow, because of the distribution of the nap room, I ended up being the primary. A child always needs a primary. It's this kind of thing.
Yes.
If the mother leaves, then they need
Yes.
that primary.
Absolutely.
So I was her primary, and all I did was I would just take her out of the room, and she would scream bloody murder on my lap, and I'd just say, you don't need to do this. You don't need to do this. Yeah. You don't have to be this way. You don't have to be this way.
Right.
One day, this was probably like a beneficent cruelty, but she was just on the playground, everybody's having fun, and she's screaming bloody murder, just standing there screaming and screaming. So I took out my little cell phone and I recorded her, and then I showed her, and she saw herself just like for no reason doing that. But after we passed that gauntlet, which was a pretty tough time, I guess she was at one note, so I figured out how to tune it out for me. But once you pass that bend, magically there's just a time where they're like, okay. And then they can start to work on other faculties and start to engage and start to build friendships and stuff like that. It's just some people have a longer arc to get through than others.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And with a child, it's, you see degrees of willfulness. By the time they get to an adult, there might have been a whole lot of other stuff built in by there where untying that knot may take a very long time because it took a long time to tie that knot.
Yeah.
So, but that's what pastors do.
That's what pastors do.
Yeah, that really is. And most of the time we fail. There's knots in my church that they will not be untied before Jesus comes. It will not happen. But we will love them and we will care for them, and we will grow in our untying abilities as we work with these these knots that will never be untied.
We should wrap up. I have a.
Yep. Now I'm going to have to figure out what to do here.
We have things out to do. I really do appreciate how you're laying down, and I think you even said this explicitly. You're like, at some point you're like, okay, Peterson's doing the thing, but what we need is community. What we need is actually getting into the actual relationship building part of this thing. And
you need an arena for that character to develop, and you need modeling in the arena.
Yeah. And I think that your skills are very complementary to bringing this out of this, this meta divine realm of IDW personalities and memes, and that you're showing how that can happen. So I appreciate that.
No,
I would follow your example, but I don't want to deal with the Discord server. So
no, I'm not recommending it. But the people, I don't deal with it either. I mean, it runs itself. It doesn't run itself. There are leaders who run it, and sometimes they get weary. But there's enough of them that they can
cycle through,
take turns, but it's been a good thing.
Well, I'll let you solve the problems of your perfect world.
Okay. I will. Thank you so much. And I very much appreciate what you do. I send people to your channel, and
we got a little ecosystem going on.
Yeah, we do. So, we do. It's a cool thing.
Reciprocal. All right. Yeah. Broadening. All right. Have a good day.
Take care, Benjamin.
Ciao.